What's up, guys? Welcome to Waggle Friends English. Today we're going to talk about how to study English without studying English. And then we're going to talk about second language acquisition versus language learning. So it's going to be kind of fun.
We have met far too many of our students that have been studying language for a long time but still can't actually communicate or talk in that language. And a lot of this comes down to the idea that they have learned a language but they haven't really acquired it. And so we've personally experienced this as well with our first or second languages that we've studied.
Yes.
And a lot of times we spend time learning them, we spend time worrying about the test, and then when the class is over, all that information just goes out the window.
Just goes away. Yeah. So we're going to talk about how to just integrate English into your daily life and make that part of your routine and everything, your lifestyle, because that's how you acquire language. But let's get into talking about the differences between the two, and then we're going to talk about how to study English without studying English. First things first, when you are studying a language, where does language learning come from? The way we use textbooks and teachers and tutors and tests and all that stuff, that comes from school. And that doesn't start till you're 3 in some countries and 5 in many other countries. Maybe not most other, but many other countries. But that's where we start to get this idea of breaking down our language and having very specific patterns to go through. That's where we learn grammar. That's where we learn language analysis and comprehension. That's very intentional. That's when we learn just all kinds of really structured stuff. And those things are not bad, but they are something that we get this idea from school that we should study other languages that way.
A lot of times people think that learning a language is having a textbook. I actually was talking to one of my students recently, and that's exactly what they said, is that they learned their language through a textbook, but that's not exactly true. We learn languages, our heart languages, our mother tongues, we learn them through another means. But so why do people even bother to do learning language to begin with? I personally believe it's because it's easier on the teacher. It's easier on me. If I have a textbook, I can work through the textbook. I know what all of my students have heard, as opposed to me saying, why don't you come walk with me and we'll teach each other this language. That's a lot more difficult to measure. It's a lot more difficult to test on, but it is how we learn language. It's how we learn in general.
So language acquisition, and Josh is starting to touch on it there, is language acquisition it starts in the womb. When you first develop your ears and you're able to hear, the fetus is able to hear sounds outside the womb. They're able to hear their mothers talking. They're able to hear their fathers talking, or anyone around who's talking. That's when they start to really be introduced to their language. Once they're born, they still spend 15 months to 2 years simply listening. This is called the silent period in second language acquisition theory. So this silent period happens, they're listening and they're starting to experiment with the sounds. They're starting to do a little bit with the diphthongs, and they might eventually get to BR sound like brr, brr, or something like this with English in particular. But this is fun because this is where our daughter is now. She's starting to really experiment with the sounds quite a bit. And that means she'll just sit there going, sometimes, but that's what she's doing. She's experimenting, and she experiments with the sounds and watches us until she comes and happens upon the right sound. So she just recently started saying hi, hi, and everybody just smiles and waves back and says the same thing back. It confirms to her, and that's what her smile is about, it confirms to her that she's doing the right thing. And so she has learned that, and she has absorbed it, and now she knows to use it in certain situations, and at certain times she knows how to do that. She's also learned bye, the same thing, hi and bye. She knows the difference now because she's experimented and received the proper results. So this is how you acquire a language. Which one is better?
It really depends on your goal in language. So for example, a lot of people, they would look at that illustration of our daughter and say, I don't have time for that. I don't have 2 years to spend listening before I even begin speaking. There's no way I can learn a language in 12 years because I got to pass that test tomorrow. I got to pass that test at the end of the semester. And so the real question is, what is your goal in language learning? And so if your goal is a short-term goal that you have to do by the end of the year, by the end of this semester, then acquiring a language really isn't going to be super possible for you. But if your goal is to actually be able to communicate, to speak to people, to have this language internalized
and use it the rest of your life,
then you need to go for a long game kind of language learning acquisition style.
Yeah. And it's really important too that you realize we've had many students that there was this major English test they had to take in university at the end of their studies.
Mm.
And so a lot of them would procrastinate until their junior year, then start to freak out because they studied English in high school and in middle school, but by the time they got to college, they were like, other things are more important, until they realized that test was next year and they had forgotten everything they learned before.
Mm.
So what they do is they just memorize. They try to memorize everything. We are very against trying to memorize language because it just doesn't work. Even for short-term goals, doesn't really work. You need to be listening and acquiring somewhat to some degree in order to pass that test. And then you can forget all about English altogether. But if you don't have a framework of solid reading and listening consistently in your life, everything that you're trying to memorize has nothing to hang on to. And so once you finish that test, it all just kind of goes poof, it all goes up in smoke.
Yeah. And again, personally, that's what happened to our second languages that we've learned. But
Yes.
Chinese has been different. We have, maybe not super well, but we have acquired being able to speak Mandarin while we have maybe just learned the other languages and then lost them.
Yeah. So even now, 2 years out of China, we're still able to talk to each other in Mandarin, which is really cool. Again, it's not perfect, but we remember far more now than we did before with the other two languages. So I'm not saying that language learning, structured language learning, does not work. I want that to be clear. I'm saying that it works for the short term. It is not a long-term solution. It is not a long-term thing. Yes, it is possible to learn English and even become an advanced speaker, possibly fluent, if you are one of those people lucky enough to have 6 hours a day to pour into English. But most of us don't have that ability. Most of us have 15 minutes to put into a language, especially if you work and you have a family and you study. So it's one of those things that you have to be really careful of. What's more important than that, though, is your textbooks and your teachers and your structured curriculum is not going to teach you acceptable English grammar. They're going to teach you proper English grammar. And that's all good and well until you realize that English speakers, native English speakers, use illogical grammar like good and well. So it's very important that you acknowledge the difference between proper English grammar within structured learning and acceptable English grammar that you're going to pick up naturally with language acquisition. We've got a video up here to check out about the difference between proper English grammar and acceptable English grammar.
But then the question people always ask us then is, how can you actually acquire a language? How can you learn English without actually studying English? How is that even possible?
Well, you've got to make an English island. If you are in a different country, if you're in a country that does not speak English, maybe they study English, but they don't actually speak it and everything, you've got to do your best to make an English language learning culture in your home.
Mm.
That means everything you do already just for fun and relaxation and just making things happen in your house needs to be done in English. That means communicating with your spouse or your kids in English. That means reading only English books. That means taking in English news, podcasts, music, watching movies in English, all the English. Right?
Social media, games, video games, all of that, everything that you do on a normal daily basis, do that, but in English. And when you do that, you're creating this environment. You are basically creating an immersive environment for you to learn English. And so
yes.
We've said that multiple times to our students, even here on this channel, that you have to have that environment. You cannot acquire a language without that environment. And so if you don't have that environment, you have to create it.
Think about how much you would learn if you were completely surrounded by the language. This is why people go and study abroad. This is why people go and they visit the language that they're learning and they try to live there for a while to immerse themselves in the language. But if you've already done that, you're more likely to pick up proper pronunciation. You're going to know what sounds wrong because you've listened to it all the time. You're going to see acceptable English because you're going to see people using it and speaking it all the time. But it means you have to change everything that you're putting in into English in order to really acquire that language and honestly study without really paying attention, which is really cool. But that also means that you're not only studying English in structured ways. That means you're not just looking at textbooks. That means you're not just listening to teachers and practicing with English language partners. That means you are using the language, taking it in its natural form, and learning acceptable English as you go. Again, we're not saying don't use those structured things. We're saying if you are hearing something over and over again and you wonder, what does that mean? What does good and well mean? That seems so illogical. Look it up then. Because now you have a dozen memory hooks that you can sink in because of all the times you've either read or heard it recently. That is so much more powerful than learning something cold. Cold turkey learning is really difficult to do because you actually do have to memorize it, and then you have to remember to think of all the things you've learned that week and listen for it. Hear it first, read it first, then look it up.
Yeah, and so for you guys, we highly encourage you to be able to not just try to create this environment and then do nothing with it. The best thing would to be actually to integrate both of these approaches and to primarily do the language acquisition, because that's very difficult to actually implement if you're not purposefully trying to do it, but then supplement that with some language learning tactic. We're not saying never use a textbook ever again, but we are saying that a lot of times you hear these common things that are around you. You hear the same word over and over again, and you say, I don't know what that means. And so then you go to the dictionary, then you go to your flashcards, and you can be able to figure out what that means. And the odds of you learning it are really, really high.
Right. And to this day, both of us can hear something in Mandarin and be like, that doesn't sound right. I don't remember hearing that repeatedly before. And so it's something that's just really, really cool way to know that we've internalized enough of the language in order to perceive the language in a lot of ways. Now, we did not spend enough time to be advanced speakers. However, we can understand far more than you would expect from people who've lived completely disengaged from hardly any Chinese people for 2 years.
Yeah.
So make sure that you are using comprehensible input. That's one of the first things that you should really focus on with language acquisition. When I'm talking about creating this English language learning culture in your home, we do not mean make sure you're listening to Shakespeare, okay? That's not going to work. You need to surround yourself with like children's books, children's novels, children's material, children's songs, things that are easy to understand. Start with the milk and then grow into the meat.
Think about it this way. If you tried to learn advanced English when you were a beginner, then you just wouldn't be able to understand it all. And then you wouldn't even be able to ask those questions of that language that you're already learning. Rather, you should take this and take it almost like a beginner level 1. And then as you grow in your language, you level up the language learning tactics that you already have and level up the input that you're taking in. So like you said, start with children's books, and then maybe later on you get to Shakespeare.
It is possible to be immersed in the English language in an English-speaking country and not learn English. We saw this all the time with foreigners living in China who had lived there for 2 decades and still did not know Mandarin. It is also possible to pour thousands of dollars and thousands of hours into English language learning and not actually be able to pass or break intermediate level. We've also seen this. So it's very important that you learn and you go about learning English in a very smart way by acquiring it and learning what to plug into it.
And making it a lifestyle, making it a consistent lifestyle. Because a lot of the people that I've even met who studied Chinese or studied English, they really didn't want to make it a lifestyle. They just wanted to be able to speak Chinese. And so in so doing, they really didn't have enough motivation to get them over those walls and through those blocks to make them actually acquire the language.
So the key to learning English is consistency. And the way that you can be consistent is by creating a lifestyle of acquiring English, by replacing the things that you already do in your own language with English. By doing so, you are studying English without actually studying English.
So in our next video, we're going to talk about how to learn English in a different way than is what oftentimes people try to tout as a good language learning or language acquiring strategy.
We're actually going to talk about how you can create that island of English culture in your home. We're going to talk about how to study English with your family, some fun ways to get the kids involved, ways that you can start putting this into practice, this language acquisition into practice, because it's a fun way to do it and it's a great way to do it. And honestly, kids are strangely good at it. So don't be worried about whether or not they'd like it or be good at it. They're better at it than we are as adults. So definitely stick around for that. If you really like videos concerning English language acquisition, English language learning, and some acceptable English grammar and phrases and how to study them and how to remember them in ways like studying English without actually studying, then definitely hit that subscribe button and come see us again. All right. We'll catch you guys on the next one.
Bye.